We're on. We have some people on. So welcome. Welcome to those who are watching us live and to those who will be watching us later when this is recorded. I'm Alexandra Kuykendall, and I am here today with Jen Podkul from KIND, Kids in Need of Defense. I can hear a little bit of an echo, Jen, I think, from your computer. Is that possible?
Maybe.
I just don't want other people to be hearing that as well. So I'm going to introduce myself and talk a little bit about why we invited Jen to be here. I'm an author, and I was invited to go on a trip with Welcome and some other groups down to the border at the end of August to learn about what was happening this summer with family separation and what's happening currently with kids specifically and families around issues at the border. And I went for a number of reasons. I worked at MOPS International for a number of years. Many of you know MOPS as the church's biggest ministry to moms. It's a church-based ministry. And so for almost 10 years, I wrote about the importance of mothering and the church's value of mothering. And because we say that we are pro-family as Jesus people, I wanted to know more about what was happening specifically with families. And so that was part of the reason I went. I was invited by Michelle Warren, who works for CCDA, which is the Christian Community Development Association. And I thought it sounded like a very interesting trip. So when I was on the trip, I met Jen. Jen is a lawyer with KIND, which I mentioned is Kids in Need of Defense. And she's going to give us a little bit of an introduction here in a second, but I just want to give my endorsement for her wisdom because she answered all of our questions. This was a group of women who didn't know a whole lot. Some of us knew different amounts about legally what was happening and the ramifications and the causes and the interpretations of the current laws and what everything meant as far as how it impacted real people, the real people that we were seeing, and why things are in place and why things have changed in recent months. And so she was just so helpful to us as we were learning that we wanted people to learn right along with us. Okay, so we are hoping that we're not frozen right now. We're going to just keep talking. Okay, Jen? We're just getting some comments that maybe things are moving. Okay, so if you have questions for Jen as we're talking, please put them in the comments and we'll have a chance to get to some of them. I'm not sure if we'll have a chance to get to all of them because there are some things we want to cover. But Jen, let's get started with you giving us a little introduction of who you are and what KIND does.
Sure. Thanks so much. Thanks, Alex. This is a really great experience for me to be able to travel with you all down to the border. I think sometimes I get into kind of technical world, and to be able to be with people who are seeing things with fresh eyes and coming at it with a real human approach, you know, human being mothers, being sisters, being daughters, and just seeing at it and thinking about what it is like for the other humans on the other side. Was really helpful and really refreshing. So it was a great experience for me too. I greatly appreciated it. So as Alex said, I work with Kids in Need of Defense, and we are a national organization that provides free attorneys to unaccompanied children. So unaccompanied children who have come to the United States asking for protection, when they are sent to immigration court, the US government does not give them a free lawyer. They're allowed to bring somebody if they can find somebody. But for many of these children, it's much too costly to hire private attorneys. What we do is we work with private law firms and corporations, and we recruit attorneys who are willing to take these kids' cases for free. So we recruit the attorneys, we train them on this kind of law, and then we mentor them through the case. And in that way, we're really able to leverage the generosity of the private sector to support these kids. You know, and the goal is we want to get to the bottom of every child's story. We want to find out who really needs protection, and it's in their best interest to stay in this country, and who would be safe if they returned back to their home community. The children that we have traditionally served are truly unaccompanied. So kids who are arriving without their parents or legal guardians. Some of them may be traveling in a group of kids, a group of teenagers together. Some may be traveling with an extended family member. but under US law, they're deemed unaccompanied. What we saw this summer was a little different. We saw families, so parents coming with their children to our border to ask for protection, and they were being physically separated. So then we started seeing kids who were rendered unaccompanied. So they were the separated kids, not the traditionally unaccompanied kids. So Kind was in a position to be able to serve both. So we were both able to serve the traditionally unaccompanied kids and then also the newly separated kids.
So can you explain what it means when a family comes and asks for protection? Because I think for a lot of people, when they picture people crossing the border, they don't understand, at least I didn't until I was there with you and you were explaining it to me, what it means to ask for protection versus just crossing without permission.
Sure. So you may have heard the term refugee, or you may have heard the term asylum seeker. So a refugee is somebody who is able to go somewhere outside of the United States and ask for protection from the United States government. So an example might be a refugee camp in the Middle East or in Africa. And the United States can process that person abroad, decide if they need protection, and then resettle them here as a refugee. An asylum seeker is someone who doesn't have that option. There's no office to go to where they live. There's no UN camp where they are. So they're not able to ask for protection where they are in their home country. What they have to do is they have to come to our border and ask for protection. And that's explicitly laid out in our law. Our law provides for somebody to be able to come to our border and ask for protection. Now, there's two different ways you can come to our border. You could come through an official port of entry. So that's like a bridge on the southern border. That could be coming through an international airport, and you would present yourself and you would ask for protection. Other people are coming to our border between an official port of entry. So that could be like where we went in South Texas, and they would present themselves to a Border Patrol agent. And that's someone you may have seen on TV who wears that green uniform, and you would ask them for protection. And usually what that means is you're going to apply for something called asylum under US law, meaning that you have either suffered persecution in your home country or you would suffer if you had to return back to your home country.
So what was different this summer is that people were coming and asking for protection, and the goal was separating parents from kids. Is that true? That was different this summer?
Yeah, so what happened this summer is under US law, it can be a misdemeanor to try to enter the country between a port of entry. So trying to come in outside of a bridge or an airport. Traditionally, because international law and the Refugee Convention, which the United States signed after World War II, says you shouldn't be criminally prosecuting asylum seekers. These are people who may not have been able to get their papers together or been able to get a visa, secure a visa before they came to the country. So we should not be criminally prosecuting them. So traditionally, the United States never prosecuted people who were asking for protection between ports of entry. They prioritized the humanitarian nature of the situation rather than criminalizing or prosecuting the misdemeanor. This summer, what happened is the government decided that they wanted to prosecute 100% of the people who were entering between a port of entry, regardless whether they were asking for protection and regardless if they were a parent or even with a baby. So what was happening is when all those parents were being prosecuted for misdemeanors, their children were being left alone in the Border Patrol detention centers. So they were then rendered unaccompanied. And in that moment, then they went over to a whole new system that's designed specifically for unaccompanied children. The prosecutions that we saw this summer, again, it's a misdemeanor that people are being prosecuted for. So by the time the judge saw these people, the federal judges were sentencing people to the time that they'd already served while they were waiting to see the judge. And unfortunately, what was happening, it was such a drain on resources for prosecutors to be doing this. The Justice Department reported that they were unable to prosecute other crimes like drug smuggling, which is really important work on the U.S. southern border, as you know.
Right. I think that really struck me when I was there, that there is a real legit reason for us to have a secure border because we have criminal activity as far as drugs, especially coming into our country, because we also have a national drug consumption crisis. So as drugs are coming in, we have to have strong borders. And yet the only system that is in place seems to be dealing with this humanitarian crisis and the drug crisis and the people involved in that in the same way.
Right.
That it's the same people who are trained and the same people who are intervening at the border. And so their approach feels very much like a military approach rather than a humanitarian approach. And can you talk about where people are coming from currently? Because that was news to me as well. When I think about in my own neighborhood in Denver, most of my immigrant neighbors are from Mexico, but that's not who we were encountering in this asylum process. Can you talk about who's currently requesting asylum?
Sure. You know, what's really interesting about Mexico is right now we have a negative net migration for Mexico, meaning there are more Mexicans who had been living in the United States who want to go back to Mexico than the number of Mexicans who are trying to get in the United States. Mexico has a really great economy right now. They're having a new president being sworn in, and folks are really wanting to either stay in Mexico or go back to Mexico and not come here. So the people that we are seeing who are being encountered on the southern border are mostly from an area called the Northern Triangle of Central America. So that means Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And you know, this trend really started in about 2012 is when we started seeing a big increase of asylum seekers from those countries. And at first it was young people. And so what we've done as an organization at Kind is really look at what's happening in Central America. Why all of a sudden are we getting young people coming from this area that had been relatively stable for many years? And what we've seen is a proliferation of organized crime and gang activity that's really targeting young people, right? Gangs are recruiting and going after young boys and girls, youth. And so that's why we really started seeing a spike in 2014 of young people trying to come here and asking for protection. So that means is they have to leave their home countries in Central America and traverse through Mexico, which can be incredibly dangerous, to try to ask for protection in the United States. But I think the other thing that's really interesting, and which I think a lot of people don't know about, is that it's not just that Central Americans are coming to the United States. Costa Rica has an incredible amount of people going to their country asking for protection. Nicaragua, before the past month or two, a lot of Central Americans were going to Nicaragua to ask for protection. Belize has received a large number of asylum seekers, particularly from El Salvador. And what we're noticing is that just like in any refugee crisis around the world, when people flee their homes, they go to where they know somebody, right? If I had to leave my house, where am I going to go? I'm thinking about my family. I'm thinking about my closest friends. So people are really choosing the countries based on where they have some sort of connection, some sort of support system. So I think, you know, the important thing is looking at what's happening in Central America, you know, and the dangerousness of it. We need to be worried in terms of our own national security, right? Because these are countries in our backyard, to make sure that we're not being put at danger, and really think about this refugee flow as a national security issue. So how can we provide humanitarian assistance in the short term? And what can we be doing in the long term to make sure these countries are safe so that people don't have to leave in the first place?
Mm-hmm. Right. And I think we do hear a lot about gang members coming in to the U.S. and recognizing that sometimes they are. But a lot of the people who are trying to come in truly are families that are trying to flee, or kids. Can you talk to us about the current state of kids that were separated? Are there still children that were separated this summer from their parents that have not been reunified? And what's being done for them? What's their status right now?
Yeah, sure. It's a good question. So about over 3,000 children were separated from their parents as part of the zero tolerance policy. There was a lawsuit, and so a federal judge ordered the government to reunify these families. So since that order, organizations have been scrambling and working furiously to identify where the kids went, where the parents went. Unfortunately, when the physical separations happened, there was no mechanism that the government used to track where they sent the child or where they sent the parent. So the government has really had to rely on nonprofit organizations and non-governmental organizations for support in locating and reuniting some of these families. Now, some of these families were both still in the United States, both the parents and kids were in the US, so they were able to be reunified. Some of them were reunified in a family detention facility. Some were released on an alternative to detention so that until they show up for their asylum hearing. some parents had been deported quickly or had accepted deportation quickly in order, thinking that they would be reunified. Some of those parents are still in their home country and their children are here in the United States. So what KIND and other organizations are doing is we are working to communicate with the parents in the home country as well as the children and figure out what's going to be in the best interest of those children and for those families. Is it for the child to go back to home country right away? Does that child want to stay here to be able to ask for protection? And it's really a matter of, having, regular communication with them, explaining to them their options, talking to children several times, because they're making very difficult decisions, life-altering choices. So there's still over approximately 200 kids who are still separated from their parents. The federal judge who has been on this case has taken a great interest in this case and spent a lot of time. The parties are before the judge regularly giving updates, specific updates on specific cases. The judge has been very diligent about monitoring the situation.
Okay. And as far as human trafficking, we often hear that we need to be concerned about kids coming in with adults because the adults that are coming with them aren't their parents, or we don't know if they are their parents, that they're claiming to be their parents. And there's a concern that kids are being trafficked and therefore separating them from the adults that are crossing with them is in their best interest. Can you speak to that a little bit about just how common that is, about what the current process is to determine that, and what your suggestions maybe would be to improve the system?
Sure, that's a great question. And look, everyone's priority is making sure that the children are safe, right? That's number one priority. So there's actually a federal trafficking law called the Trafficking Victim Protection Act. And in 2008, there were a lot of provisions added to that to ensure the safety of children. And a lot of the section on unaccompanied children in that 2008 law talks a lot about the kind of screening that we do for these kids at the border. So when there are questions as to familial relationships, if there are questions as to whether or not the adult traveling with the child is safe, Customs and Border Protection has the authority to separate so that there can be more investigation to make sure that that family is indeed a family unit and that adult is safe for that child. Now, there have always been instances, several a year, in which it is identified that that adult with a child is not a safe person, which is why we have provisions in the law that allow the government to separate when there is a question. And then they have the child go and they are screened by child welfare professionals. They are screened by social workers who have expertise in human trafficking to really get at, and then they can do document review. They work with the consulates of the home countries to do document review, to confirm parentage or familial relationship. So we have systems in place. I think the difference is what we saw this summer is that it was a blanket separation and it had nothing to do with whether or not that person was a danger to the child. That did not factor in, and those were not the questions that were being asked. It was more about how the mechanics of the prosecutions worked. I think we absolutely want to make sure that children are safe from anyone who potentially can be dangerous. But I think what happens is we need to make sure that there are folks with child welfare training and child interviewing skills who are working in those Customs and Border Protection facilities so that they have expertise to do those kinds of interviews for the kids, because we want kids to be safe from that. I think the other thing we need to do is make sure that when we do those separations to further investigate a situation, the cases are linked and there is information. So should there be determination that that adult is safe for the child, those people can be reunified quickly back together. And we're not in the situation where we were this summer, where it's impossible to track where the child went and the child and the parent can find themselves again. So I think the government needs to do what it had been doing before, which is whenever there's a red flag or a concern, there's a temporary separation until experts can look further into the case. So we have that written into our law. I think we need to make sure that that's robust and we have properly trained people who are executing that law.
Right. Because we do want kids to be safe, right, as they cross the border. And then is there a risk for people being vulnerable once they have crossed. I just think about kids who have been separated from whoever they are traveling with, whether it's an older sibling or a grandparent. Once they're here in the US, do they become more vulnerable if they have been separated from somebody? I mean, it almost feels to me like, is the problem becoming worse when we create this separation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we want the kids to be their parents or someone who's best for them. So the Office of Refugee Resettlement, who is responsible for taking care of unaccompanied children, their goal is to reunify the child with somebody in the United States who can care for that child while the child's going through their court case. So hopefully, if a child was separated from the extended family member or somebody else, that there can be a reunification so that the children aren't sitting in a detention center all by themselves, but they're living in a loving home with somebody who really has their best interest at heart. So that's going to be the best way to make sure that they're not vulnerable. The other thing that we've seen at Kind, and I'd seen in my own practice, is that, when kids have attorneys, that's just another check on the child, right? That's another adult who has confidentiality with the child, right? A lawyer has confidentiality. The child can share information with that adult. It's another third party who's really looking out for the best interests of the child, making sure that they're safe, making sure the home's safe, they're in school, and that they're complying with the immigration court process. So in terms of thinking about what can we be doing better to make sure that the kids are safe and not being made more vulnerable, giving kids lawyers is really one of the best ways to do that.
Well, thank you. And thank you for doing that, because we know that you're helping to make that happen. Can you talk to us a little bit about the Flores agreement? Because that was a term I hadn't heard before. And then when I came back from the trip, it was suddenly in the news again. I mean, I'd heard maybe a little bit about it this summer, but it was one of those things, those legal terms that just kind of went in one ear and out the other. And can you talk about that and why it's important and why it's in the news right now?
Sure, yeah. Folks in my field have been joking about this. It's a very obscure legal settlement that's been around for a long time that I think about 10 people in the whole country knew what it was before this summer. And all of a sudden it has been getting a lot of attention. So what it was is the government was sued many years ago, back when there was no Homeland Security and it was Immigration and Naturalization Services. And they were sued because they had a child in their custody for a very long period of time who had been both mistreated in custody and also been held in conditions that were inappropriate for children. So as part of that lawsuit, the government entered into a settlement agreement with the parties and said, we are going to outline minimum standards of detention for children. So anytime the federal government is going to detain an immigrant child, here's some minimum standards that we will agree to. We will agree to try to keep a child in the least restrictive setting possible. So not use a high security facility for a young child. That would be inappropriate. There would be a preference for family unity. So when possible, the government would try to reunify a child with a family member as quickly as possible. And then there were other specific, very minimum standards and oversights for any time the government was detaining a child. What we saw this summer is during the separations, part of what the administration said is that they can't hold on to family units together because the Flores Settlement only allows them to hold on to family units together at a facility for 20 days. So I will say specifically what the settlement says is that the government can't hold children in unlicensed facilities for longer than 20 days. What the settlement agreement says is that if you're going to hold a child and you're going to have these child facilities, they need to have licensing requirements. And that's to ensure that they meet with all the other kinds of minimum standards for the ways where we hold children and process children in all areas of our government, not just immigration. So this has been a big point of contention, and there have been a lot of members of Congress who have talked about changing the standards, the Flores standards. The administration has proposed new rules instead of the rules that are part of the settlement agreement right now. They have put out a proposal that would change some of those rules and kind of lessen the standards in which they're able to hold children and really lessen the oversight in which they're holding children. So advocates are very worried about a reduction of standards. There have been some very tragic articles that have come out in the past few months about terrible things that have happened to kids in immigration detention just in the past few months, both unaccompanied children and children in family facilities.
Mm-hmm.
And we think it's really important that we have minimum standards and that there's oversight. So, that has no bearing as to whether or not a child will eventually win their case or whether or not they'll stay in the country, but that while they're here and while we're detaining them, we have an obligation to treat them at least with the minimum standards to make sure that no further harm comes to them while they're here in our country.
And that seems to be just kind of par for how we operate in the US. There's standards for foster care families, standards for daycare centers, standards. I mean, we have standards for everything. So it's not a surprise. It's a good thing that we are saying that we have a certain standard of how we're going to care for children that are essentially in the government's custody, correct?
Exactly.
Yeah. And that the reason that these standards exist is because when there weren't any, children were not treated well, or some children were not treated well, I should say.
Exactly, yeah. So the idea is if we're able to keep the standards where they are, we know we have at least a baseline, how we're going to keep these kids, and that their oversight to make sure that people can go in and there's a little sunlight on these facilities to make sure that they're safe while they're here.
Yeah. Well, Jen, we're going to wrap up here in the next couple of minutes, and I want to thank you for your work. I want to thank you for coming on the trip that we went on to educate us, and for being here today to answer questions and to kind of give us the basics of the legal happenings on what's happening with children and families on the border. And to my friends who are watching, I want to say thank you for watching. We're going to continue this discussion in the comments. We're also going to link to a resource that's called the Families at the Border Explainer. So how's that for a title? And it can give you some more information about what's happening with families at the border. And is there anything, Jen, that you think people could do to become more involved? We will certainly have things happening, and comments. In the comments, people can put their ideas about how they can support kids and families that are in the immigration process, or can help maybe sway legislation in a way that honors families, because we believe that families do belong together and that children should be with their parents. And that as God's people, we really want to be at the forefront of advocating for kids' welfare, but also for families' welfare. If we say that we are pro-family, this is a great example where we can use our collective voice to say that families, regardless of their immigration status, that they belong together because God created families and He put children with their parents, and we believe that they should stay with their parents. So do you have any last words or suggestions for people who are listening who might want to do something a little proactive?
Yeah, sure. And please check out our website, supportkind.org. There we always have action alerts, things people can do if they want to speak up. We comment on different proposals of legislation, opportunities to let your representatives know how you feel. I think the one thing we saw this summer is that people's voices really do matter. When Americans really stood up and spoke up this summer and said, you should not be taking babies from their mothers in our name, it worked, right? It ended. I just encourage people to really speak up and just tell their representatives what their red lines are. You don't have to know everything about immigration law to understand that there's some fundamental standards that you want your representatives to really uphold for Americans. So I say, please continue to speak up, because that's going to tell them, where the negotiating point really needs to start. And everybody did a really great job with that this summer.
Yes. Well, I'm sorry that we had to have a crisis like this in order to speak up, but now we know that is something that is kind of a collective value that we hold in this country. And I so appreciate it. And I think it's a collective value of the church. So thank you, Jen, for being here. And again, let's keep the conversation going in the comments. I'm excited to see and be part of that. Okay.
Thanks,
Have a great day. Bye.